It's the dead of winter, 1876. Picture a snow-blasted mountain in remote Montana territory, surrounded by nothing but pines, cold wind, and silence. Now imagine you're a doctor nearing a cabin, closer to the Canadian border than to any true town, and what you find there would turn your blood to ice. Dr. Theodore Brennan comes here on what he thinks is a simple welfare visit. Instead, he finds a stack of crude medical records and something much worse. Beneath the cabin's floorboards lie 7 tiny wrapped bundles, the preserved remains of infants, all sharing the same haunting deformities. These weren't accidental deaths. The Donnelly family, he'd discover, had a secret method for deciding which children lived and which would vanish without a trace, all to keep their bloodline pure. Their ritual? Eliminate any child that failed some twisted standard. There's a dark history of infanticide in isolated cultures, sometimes hidden under the guise of tradition. But the Donnellys? They took this taboo to a whole new level, stretching it over generations and keeping it methodical, almost clinical. 5 generations documented like livestock breeding, but with their own flesh and blood. What really shakes Dr. Brennan to his core isn't just the bodies, nor the heartbreaking precision of the records. It's that this scheme of selective infanticide isn't a one-off case of mountain madness. It's a genetic experiment, deliberate, organized, spanning continents and 100 years of secrecy. What would drive a family to such extremes? And would you survive in their place with isolation and paranoia closing in? Let us know in the comments what state or country you're viewing from. Before we dig deeper into why this family built such chilling traditions, make sure you're subscribed and smash that notification bell. You don't want to miss what comes next, because the horrors the Donnellys hid for a century are just beginning to claw their way to the surface. You might think this story began with that gruesome cabin scene in Montana, but the Donnelly family's descent into darkness actually started thousands of miles away in the misty green hills of County Cork, Ireland. Long before Dr. Brennan set foot on their property, the Donnellys' name was whispered with dread in their home parish. Back in the brutal winter of 1798, their patriarch launched what would later be called a bloodline experiment, all under the guise of strengthening their stock. It wasn't uncommon for Irish families, especially after the Great Famine, to cling fiercely to tradition and kin. But the Donnellys crossed a line most wouldn't even dare speak about. Their troubles caught up with them thanks to Father Michael O'Sullivan, a local priest respected for his discretion. This time even he was so appalled by what he uncovered, deliberate inbreeding and hidden children sent to God, that he threatened Patrick Donnelly with public exposure and excommunication. That's the kind of scandal that would make anyone flee. Desperate to erase their tracks, the Donnellys staged an escape. They didn't just hop on a ship to America. They covered their trail with expertly forged documents, fake job records, and a whole story about being simple potato farmers recovering from famine. The truth? They never set foot in Brooklyn despite what their papers said. They went straight from Ireland, running from shame and secrets that, in those days, might have gotten them arrested, or worse. It's worth noting that after Ireland's famine, thousands of families did flee, some genuinely with nothing, others running from the kinds of secrets best kept in the old country. Hidden societies like the Molly Maguires and tales of family curses weren't unheard of, but very few had scandals this chilling, and even fewer left behind evidence. And for all this planning, all this running, the Donnellys still couldn't outrun the chain of horror they started back home. Have you ever heard stories of a scandal so big a family had to vanish overnight? Maybe even in your own town? Drop your thoughts or stories below, but don't get too comfortable. The next chapter in Montana gets even darker, and the Donnellys' careful plans are about to unravel in ways no one could predict. Montana in the 1870s wasn't the Wild West you see in movies. It was even rougher. Imagine a territory where law existed mostly on paper, where you could vanish into the forests or mountains and never be found. Helena, the so-called capital, barely scraped together 8,000 residents, all clinging to the dying embers of the gold rush. Violent disputes over mining claims, clashes with native tribes, and blizzards that swallowed whole wagons were facts of daily life. Why would the Donnelly family choose to bury themselves in such an unforgiving place? Simple. Perfect camouflage. In a landscape carved by both desperation and opportunity, No one questioned a family that kept to themselves. Out here, you could hide anything. A stolen fortune, a criminal past, or even something far darker. Most people who landed in Helena were chasing wealth or fleeing something back east. For the Donnellys, it was both. They arrived in September of 1874, their wagon crammed with more than hardtack and blankets. There were gold coins, skillfully hidden, and an air of nervous urgency. They bought 160 acres in a valley so remote that snow could trap them for months, invisible even to the prying eyes of fellow settlers. Isolated families weren't rare in Montana, but most were running from the law, debts, or shame. Some, like the infamous Plummer Gang, hid out for years, dodging authorities. The Donnellys fit right in on the surface, but their true motivations went well beyond survival. The lack of doctors, the total absence of government oversight, the way neighbors could disappear for an entire season, made this the ideal laboratory for their horrifying experiment. Like this story so far? Hit that like button if you think isolation can twist people's minds, or give them the perfect place to hide their crimes. And if you're wondering how far a family will go to keep their secrets locked away, you're about to find out. The Donnellys didn't exactly blend in, even in a place where everyone had something to hide. When Patrick, his wife Bridge, and their 4 children rolled into Helena, people noticed right away. For immigrants fresh off the boat, they seemed unusually well off, packing crates not with hand-me-downs, but with well-made clothes, ledgers, and notably gold coins. Patrick claimed he was a farmer, but his hands told a different story. Soft, without the calluses of years in potato fields. Local shopkeepers whispered about his precise handwriting and formal Irish accent, hardly the hallmarks of a peasant. Bridge moved through town gaunt, wide-eyed, clutching her children so tightly it made even the roughest miners uneasy. She never argued prices but always paid in gold, counting the coins again and again. And then there was the family's appearance. They looked almost too similar. Pale blue eyes, long angular faces, and fingers that seemed just a bit too long. If you saw them together, you'd swear they were almost clones. Neighbors couldn't shake the feeling that something was just off. The Donnelly children acted strange, too. Quiet, well-mannered, but overly obedient. It was the kind of forced politeness you only see when respect is driven by fear, not love. The girls, Moira and Colleen, did chores with the efficiency of adults, moving with a haunted sort of purpose. Seamus, the eldest son, flinched at sudden noises and stammered when spoken to, especially around his father. Declan, the youngest, was the only one who sometimes cracked a real smile, but even he seemed wary, watching the graveyard behind their cabin more than he watched the mountains. Some locals, suspicious of any newcomers, gossiped about the odd Irish living up the mountain. But few dared ask questions. The Donnellys' old country roots, eerie resemblance, and uneasy discipline had a chilling effect, making even the mail carrier think twice before lingering. Have you ever met a family that seemed too odd to be coincidence? Share your strangest neighbor stories in the chat. You never know what secrets might be hiding next door. But what happened that first winter? That's when the Donnelly mystique took a deadly turn, and the isolated mountains hid secrets no one could have imagined. Winter in these mountains is brutal. By November, the Donnellys were completely cut off. 6-foot drifts blocked the only trail. For months, no one outside passed their way. But when the first spring thaw hit in March 1875, Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, braved the melting ice and reached their homestead. Right away, he knew something terrible had happened. The cabin looked patched up, its walls hastily repaired, the ground torn up as if someone had dug through frozen earth in a panic. But what really struck him was the sickly sweet smell of death, one he'd recognized all too often on the frontier. Bridge Donnelly met him at the door. In just one winter, she'd changed from a nervous settler to a shadow of herself, gaunt, shivering, her eyes empty, and her voice little more than a whisper. She muttered about a difficult winter and complications, but invited Jake in anyway. What he witnessed there would become the first true evidence of the family's disturbing practices. Inside, Bridge was in the middle of a hard, dangerous labor. Her teenage daughter Moira helped. Neither woman panicked nor surprised by the deformed infant that arrived. A twisted spine, a clubbed hand, a bloated head. Even frontier doctors saw these things rarely. The baby whimpered, breathing unevenly. But the Donnellys reacted with a practiced coldness. Patrick, in calm Irish, announced that the child wouldn't survive the week, blaming the Lord's will, and refusing Jake's offer to fetch a doctor. This reaction was far from typical. Even by harsh frontier standards, families mourned, tried to help, or called for neighbors. Anything but this measured indifference. Jake noticed more. The other children, unfazed by the newborn's condition, exchanged glances, their faces steeled. The family's discussion sounded like a grim ritual, as if birth defects were an expected, regular occurrence. When Jake returned weeks later, the infant was gone. "Lost the baby 3 days after you left," Bridge said, with no tears left to shed. She gestured to the back of the property where a neat row of child-sized graves now marked the ground, but it was her words that echoed in Jake's mind. "Buried him behind the cabin, next to the others." 4 crosses, 4 tiny mounds of fresh dirt, all from just 8 months. Such things happened in the wild, but never this quietly, never this methodically. And these graves? The crosses, all uniform and perfect, looked as though they'd been made in advance. It makes you wonder, what creeps you out more? The wildness of nature, or what desperate people do when no one is watching? If this chilling story is gripping you, hit like and tell us where you're listening from. You're going to want to stick around, because what's next is even more disturbing. The Donnelly family's isolation and the bitter winters created a pressure cooker. For those watching, it quickly became obvious. This household was nothing like the struggling settlers scratched out across Montana. Jake Harrison, the mail carrier, started to look closer on his monthly visits. The children always moved carefully, as if dreading an invisible line they must never cross. They worked harder than most adults, the girls moving through chores with a haunted, practiced silence. When they spoke to their parents, there was no warmth, only a constant, fearful obedience. Take Seamus, the oldest. His stutter grew worse each time Harrison saw him, especially if Patrick, the father, was nearby. The boy couldn't look anyone in the eye, sometimes flinching when spoken to. Moira and Colleen, just teenagers, carried themselves like women twice their age. Quiet, exhausted, always watchful. Declan, the youngest, once slipped up and admitted something that made Harrison shiver. Sometimes babies aren't right and Father says God doesn't want them to suffer. But sometimes I think God didn't decide. Their routines weren't those of a loving family. They resembled people living in a cult or a strict authoritarian community. Modern psychologists now recognize what was happening. Trauma and generational secrecy. The kind passed down in closed, damaged families. The Donnelly children were both victims and unwilling participants, forced to accept, even enforce, the destructive rules their parents believed would save them. On several occasions, Harrison overheard disturbing chatter, references to purity of the line, sacrifices our ancestors made, and the need to handle the imperfect ones. Even in a multilingual region where immigrants often spoke Gaelic at home, these specific phrases stood out, hinting at ritual and tradition far more ancient and sinister than mere superstition. Experts today study intergenerational trauma in isolated groups, cults, some religious sects, and even extended criminal families. Those children often inherit more than secrets. They carry deep psychological scars, sometimes for life. What do you think it would be like to grow up with the unbearable weight of family secrets? Could you ever escape it? Let us know in the comments below. But as the cabin doors closed for another harsh winter, even darker truths were about to emerge. Ones that would pull in outsiders and make the Donnelly curse impossible to hide. Dr. Brennan couldn't let the rumors go. Not after hearing Jake Harrison's stories. Not after digging through records that made the Donnellys' past look even more suspicious. When spring melted the snow, he seized his chance. The trek to the Donnelly cabin was grueling. Twisted trails wound through dense forest, rushing creeks, and steep slopes. By the time he arrived, Brennan knew he was stepping far beyond the reach of civilization. The cabin was well constructed and eerily tidy, more like a fortress than a homestead. But his doctor's eye spotted the oddities right away. An overgrown cemetery out back, 11 small graves in neat rows, far too many for a single family, and too evenly spaced to be the result of accidents or disease outbreaks. Fresh marks showed someone had recently expanded the graveyard, preparing sites as if expecting more deaths. These weren't emergency burials. They were systematic, planned in advance, a chilling sign of what he might find inside. Patrick Donnelly greeted Brennan. The patriarch looked much older than his years, hair gone white, hands trembling when he thought no one noticed. Bridge, gaunt and hollow-eyed, lingered silently at his side, her withered frame and constant shaking evidence of profound stress, maybe even malnutrition. The children's condition was even more telling. Moira, barely 18, showed clear signs of late pregnancy, despite the family's isolation all winter. Colleen, just 16, was developing at an unsettling rate, a combination of unusual maturity and a strange stoic submission. Most tragic was Declan, now 13, with his pronounced limp, asymmetrical face and the unnaturally long fingers that screamed of something gone wrong in the bloodline. Seamus, the oldest, seemed broken. He barely stammered out a word. When asked about family life, his face flashed panic before sinking into silence. The kids all moved as if waiting for the next unpredictable blow. Inside, the cabin was divided by heavy curtains and doors that locked from both sides. A suspicious setup. Odd, sickly smells hung in the air, part medicinal, part organic decay, suggesting practices somewhere between crude hospital and something much more sinister. Patrick finally confided in Brennan, hinting at terrible choices and methods our fathers perfected over generations. He asked, almost pleading, if Brennan could help them, without inviting the rest of the world's judgment. It was obvious. The Donnellys' isolation was no accident. It was the only way to keep their century-long experiment with human life and death safely hidden, beyond the reach of law or mercy. Curious what was waiting behind those locked doors? Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what Dr. Brennan discovered inside would make medical history and haunt him for the rest of his life. The true horror unfolded during one of the most harrowing moments any frontier doctor could imagine, a birth gone terribly wrong. In the oppressive July heat of 1876, Dr. Brennan was summoned by a frantic message. Moira Donnelly was in labor, and something was desperately amiss. Inside the sweltering cabin, Brennan was assaulted by a mix of sweat, blood, and a strange sickly sweet odor he couldn't place, one that set off every alarm in his mind. He quickly realized this wasn't an ordinary delivery. Moira was bearing twins, but not two separate babies. They were conjoined at the torso, sharing organs, fighting for each breath. For any family, this would be a catastrophe. But what Brennan witnessed was nearly void of panic or tenderness. The adults worked with an eerie calm, each step carried out with precise, emotionless efficiency. Patrick pressed Brennan with a disturbing question. Could the twins be separated so that one might survive as a normal child? As Brennan examined the babies, he spotted something chilling. Leather-bound journals, crammed under the birthing cot, filled with detailed illustrations and notes. Page after page, decade after decade. Drawings of babies with cleft palates, missing limbs, twisted spines, extra fingers, just like the infants hidden beneath the cabin floor. Some notes were in Gaelic, others in English, all obsessively tracking the outcome of each birth, the supposed quality of the children, and the methods used when a child didn't meet the family's standards. Looking deeper, Brennan found not just medical sketches, but genealogical charts, the kind you'd find in livestock breeding, only here tracing humans. These documents showed that generations of Donnellys had married first cousins, and that Patrick and Bridge themselves were products of several generations of these calculated unions. If this is giving you chills, now's the time to share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. There's more to come, and you won't want to watch alone. The journals didn't just record disease. They revealed an active, ongoing experiment. Each entry coldly weighed the baby's chances, deciding who lived, who died, and how each family member played their part. It wasn't just about survival. This was about creating a perfect line, a eugenics experiment fueled by superstitious ambition refined over 100 years. This family wasn't alone in such thinking. Throughout history, societies from ancient Sparta to early 20th century America considered improving the human race by eliminating those deemed unfit. But few, perhaps, ever carried it out so personally or methodically. Let that sink in for a second, because what Dr. Brennan was about to discover would not only haunt him, it would change the way doctors, lawmakers, and entire communities thought about family, genetics, and the nightmarish cost of obsession. As Brennan spent the night in that suffocating cabin, trying to comfort Moira and stabilize the doomed twins, he pored over the Donnelly journals. The horror deepened with every page. This wasn't a series of tragic accidents. It was a conscious, calculated, multi-generational project. The earliest entries, penned in faded ink and old Irish script, traced back to Fergus Donnelly, the family's founding patriarch. Influenced by then cutting-edge ideas in livestock breeding, he believed human beings could be sculpted the same way. Pair the best together, cull the weak, and the bloodline would become stronger, smarter, and purer. At first, improvements seemed real. Their children stood out for their looks, their brains. But as entries progressed, the upbeat tone soured. More and more births ended in heartbreak or murder, the euphemism used again and again. Merciful release. No accident, no act of God, just cold calculation. Each new generation refined the protocol. Traits considered desirable, pale eyes, angular faces, high intellect, were sought after. Deformities, cognitive disabilities, even unusual behavior meant immediate elimination. The family kept charts of marriages, noting which cousin pairings produced the best stock. By Patrick and Bridge's time, 5 generations in, the cost had caught up. Surviving children bore hidden illnesses, and the visible malformations grew worse with every birth. Brennan, trained in the latest hereditary medicine, knew what was happening. Inbreeding amplifies recessive genes. In humans, this means more birth defects, not fewer. What the Donnellys called improvement was actually a slow, tragic spiral toward genetic collapse. Their approach echoed the dark side of early genetics, a movement that would later give rise to eugenics laws in places as far apart as Indiana and Nazi Germany. But here, on the American frontier, it was even more chilling for its intimacy and utter secrecy. Patrick, after seeing Brennan's reaction to the journals, finally admitted the ugly truth. My great-grandfather thought this would make us superior, but the price... He trailed off, looking at the dying twins. So many lost, so many whose lives were nothing but suffering. I can't tell if we were cursed from the start or if it's our own doing. What's your view? Was this madness or a logical but horrific misunderstanding of heredity? Would you be able to confront the reality if it was your family? Tell us in the comments. Before we continue, think about how much medical ethics has changed. The line between experiment and atrocity was all too blurry for too long. And yet the fallout from the Donnelly project was just beginning to shake the world outside their mountain refuge. The birth and swift death of the Donnelly twins proved to be the breaking point. Brennan stayed for 3 days, doing what little was possible in that primitive cabin. The shared organs of the conjoined infants gave way to exhaustion. They both faded quietly in the early dawn. To Brennan, they were more than victims of genetics. They were the ultimate proof that the Donnelly experiment had failed. Now Brennan had both moral and legal cause to act. He returned with authorities, pushing for a full investigation. The evidence was staggering. 11 child-sized graves, each holding a child lost not to accident or disease, but to the ruthless logic of bloodline purity. The family journals spelled out everything. Diagrams, notes, and genealogies spanning more than 5 decades and 2 continents. Patrick and Bridge faced the threat of murder charges. In other territories, whole families had vanished after similar accusations, or courts had argued that madness, not malice, was to blame. Brennan's reports helped push the law into new territory. This wasn't just murder. It was systematic genetic abuse. The cost to the surviving children was devastating. Seamus, forced from age 12 to witness and help with the elimination of siblings, suffered a total psychological breakdown. Moira and Colleen, marked to become the next breeders, showed trauma rarely seen outside the worst institutions. Declan, a living example of their failed quest for genetic perfection, vanished before he could be placed in care. Some locals still claim to have seen a hunched pale boy haunting the woods years later, but the truth is lost to history. When Patrick and Bridge died in custody before ever facing trial, Patrick from a sudden stroke, Bridge from childbirth complications, their story quickly became legend. Even the Donnelly land was left to wild grass and snow. No one wanted the property, not just because of the harsh winters, but because of the whispered nightmares tied to its soil. Real-life cases like this forced changes. Advances in genetics, child protection laws, and the regulation of isolated communities all drew lessons from tragedies like the Donnellys. And the American public, for the first time, began to question if simply surviving the wilderness was enough to ensure a good life, or if frontier isolation could also breed horrors the cities could never imagine. Could something like this still happen today? In the world's forgotten corners, with enough secrecy and fear, history has a way of repeating itself. What would you do if you stumbled across such a secret? Leave your thoughts below. The Donnelly case changed everything for American medicine, law, and ideas about what families owe their children, and what happens when that goes wrong. Today, the Donnelly story stands as one of the darkest cautionary tales in American history. A family destroyed by their obsession, their legacy a graveyard overgrown by Montana grass. But their case didn't vanish. It rippled out, changing how we see heredity, ethics, and law. Dr. Brennan's carefully documented findings became early fuel for medical textbooks and legal reforms. The Donnelly's experiment helped spur laws protecting children in isolated communities and encouraged new government checks on families trying to disappear into the wilderness. Over time, stories surfaced from other corners of America, Pennsylvania, Ohio, even remote settlements out west, of families who'd quietly practiced something similar. Each case chipped away at a dangerous belief that purity could excuse anything, that family secrets were best left untouched. The lessons went further. Modern genetic counseling and child welfare protocols trace part of their origin to examples like this. Even today, the echoes remain. Recent genetic scandals, from fertility doctor frauds to hidden hereditary illnesses, still make headlines worldwide. The Donnelly's horror is a warning about unchecked authority and isolation. The same ingredients found in cults and in real-world cases of medical abuse from California to Kazakhstan. Across the globe, our growing understanding of genetics is paired with an even stronger demand for ethics, transparency, and basic decency. The Donnellys remind us why. A single family, in pursuit of perfection, can unleash suffering on a scale that haunts generations. Would you have spoken up? Protected those children? Or turned away from the signs as so many neighbors and officials once did? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget, every like, share, and subscription spreads these lessons further, protecting future generations from repeating the past. If you're still watching, you're the kind of person the world needs. Someone who asks questions and doesn't shy from uncomfortable truths. Like, share and ring the bell if the Vault of Vile is your kind of channel. Tell us your state, country, or your own family legends below. You belong here with us, unshaken in the face of history's darkest mysteries. Until next time, remember, the secrets we leave buried can sometimes be the most dangerous of all.